Now that we have some general understanding of these physical components and the environmental components of cloud infrastructure, let's talk about some of the risk assessment and risk analysis that we might do with the cloud. Like anything else, we've talked about risk assessment before. So, there's a basic process to risk assessment, which I discussed before. We talked about how first we identify our risks, then we enumerate what those losses would be if something, if one of those things that we identified happened, like a fire or a flood or denial of service attack, power failure, etc. We figure out what those losses would look like, and then we calculate the probability that it's going to happen, right? And from the probability and the enumerated losses, we can calculate what our acceptable expenses are for mitigating that risk. So what we would be willing to spend to mitigate that risk, or what makes sense to spend to mitigate that risk. Insurance companies obviously and spend a lot of time figuring out what those numbers look like. That's what actuaries do, right? They're trying to calculate exactly what it's worth to pay to mitigate those risks. So this is a well understood process, but we're going to talk about in this unit, I'm not going to talk so much about enumerating the losses and calculating probability. I'm going to talk about identifying risks in the cloud. So some of the unique risks that you have to think about when you're moving to a cloud infrastructure or when you're in a cloud infrastructure that we don't necessarily worry about as much on our own infrastructure. So one of the first ones that we talk about is provider lock-in. So provider lock-in is basically when we make considerable investments into a specific vendor, and that vendor, so once we make those investments in a specific vendor, then we're locked into that vendor. I'll give you a good example. In my work, I've been doing a lot of work with moving infrastructure to Azure. And to move to Azure, we've done some software development to make sure that we can work with Azure's object storage, that we can work with Azure's SQL environment. So a lot of intellectual property, a lot of effort went into making sure that everything works in Azure. But once we do that, we're kind of locked into Azure. Azure could, decide to jack up our rates if they wanted to. There's all kinds of things that could happen. Or maybe what if Azure goes out of business, right? I know that sounds far-fetched, but that Microsoft would go out of business. But Microsoft is, makes decisions sometimes that have consequences. A good example is where in my work I made a decision to use a component called Silverlight, which is a Microsoft component. We made a decision to use Silverlight in some of our products, and within probably 2 years of making that decision, and this is a long-term decision to invest in this technology, and within 2 years, Microsoft announced, surprise, we're not going to do Silverlight anymore. And they started winding down their support of Silverlight, which means we had to migrate everything to some new technology like HTML5. So provider lock-in is when we make these considerable investments and we're locked into that provider. So we want to make sure that we understand that risk and try to take steps to mitigate the risk of being locked into a single provider. What can we do to make sure that we could, if we had to, move to a different cloud provider and not be tightly integrated or tightly coupled to a certain provider? Another risk is the loss of governance. So we lose the ability to implement controls. So governance is an IT security policy term, and it deals with how we make decisions on implementing either technical or policy controls with our IT infrastructure. And in many cases, with these cloud providers, they sort of make the decision for you as to what you can do with technical controls because you only have so much control. Certainly, you don't have any control of the physical environment, right? So if you have a security policy about physical access to servers, when it comes to the cloud, you have no say in that physical access to servers. Maybe you could claim that accessing that management plane falls into those policies, but that's a decision that you have to make, and you have to understand how that works. So certainly something to think about is the governance, the ability to change and implement and control all of these technical controls in a cloud environment, which we may not have. And then there's compliance issues. The cloud may present some unique risks as far as geography and as far as compliance as to how we store our data, whether it's encrypted, what we're allowed to store in the cloud, what we're allowed to store in a third party. Sometimes when customers are paying you for a service, they expect you to be the primary provider of that service. And when you have an outage because of the cloud provider, customers don't want to hear that Amazon was down, therefore we were down, right? So sometimes you have to be forthcoming with that. Some compliance requires you to do that. Compliance might preclude you from using the cloud for certain things. So it's important to understand that's a risk, right? Non-compliance is a major risk. If you're not compliant with laws and regulations, it can have a drastic impact on the business. And then we have finally provider exit, which means that provider exit is sort of the opposite of us exiting, right? So provider lock-in is where the provider locks us in because we made investments in their platform. And then provider exit is when the provider decides they no longer want to provide some service. I recently got burned by this. I had that data center I was telling you about with NetCarrier, which is a Philadelphia area company. They decided that they didn't want to offer co-location services anymore. And instead of giving us notice that they were shutting down a data center, one of their data centers, we found out because they just shut it down and we didn't have cooling in the data center anymore. And they told us the power is being shut off in a week. And they gave us no time to exit, right? So that's a huge risk. I'm relying on another company for a lot of infrastructure when we're moving things to a service provider like that. So it's important to understand that and make sure you have some contractual obligations from the provider, or at least have some SLA that defines what that might look like, a provider exit. In my case, the provider did have a contract that they had to provide the services in the contract up to a certain date, and they just flagrantly violated that portion of their contract. They just ignored it. They didn't care. So I would caution you from using companies like that. If you hear about companies that do something like that. So some general risks. So many of the risks that we have. So this is the thing about the cloud. When we talk about risks, a lot of these risks, we're going to the cloud. A lot of times, by going to the cloud, I should say, we are shifting the risk to the cloud service provider. So, for example, physical access controls, that all shifts to the cloud service provider. A lot of the networking, a lot of the encryption, and so forth. Failure, right? So one of the big concerns we have when we store data is redundancy. How do we make sure we don't lose the data because of a hardware failure? When I go to the cloud service provider, they're responsible for that hardware. So I'm transferring that risk to the cloud service provider. So a lot of risks we're transferring to them. But along with the transferring of those risks, we also bring along new risks that come with virtualization or with the cloud. So with virtualization, which is an underlying technology used in the cloud, guest breakout, which I've talked about before, is a new risk. Something we don't worry about with physical environment. And for sure in our own data centers, if we're doing virtualization, we might worry about guest breakout. But that risk becomes exacerbated in the cloud because if somebody takes advantage of some vulnerability to break out of a guest OS in the cloud, and they're on the same host that we are, they may be completely unrelated from our company, and we might still be affected by that vulnerability, which again, we have no control of that vulnerability, very little control, other than contractual things we could do with the service provider, like ensuring that we have our own environment, that we're not sharing the same host or something like that. There's snapshot and image security. So when we take a snapshot or take an image of our virtual machine, that necessarily isn't stored in our own storage area, in our own storage in the cloud. It could be sharing space with other customers. We don't know, what that security looks like for the snapshots. And then sprawl is another risk, and I'll explain what sprawl is. So the term sprawl used to refer to, or still does refer to, when we talk about data center sprawl or server sprawl, you have these huge data centers, and you just, every time you have to add a new service, you're adding a new server to your infrastructure. And one day you look in your data center and you have 5,000 servers running. And with those 5,000 servers, you got 5,000 things that could fail. You've got 5,000 things that have to be managed. You've got cooling for a data center for 5,000 things. You've got power for all this stuff. And at the end of the day, you may not need all of those servers. If you retire a certain server, I'll give you a great example. In my data center, we have storage for our medical images that we store. And if we have a customer that leaves us, or if we have a customer that moves data to a new platform or something like that, or we move the data to a new platform because we're aging out one of our platforms, which is the most common. No one ever wants to shut off the old platform. It's usually a very long, slow process to retire a server and to retire storage and to retire that infrastructure. So that's what we're talking about with server sprawl. But with virtualization sprawl, we no longer have that physical data center. You can't see the servers running in a rack, right? They're all kind of running in this virtual swimming pool, and it may not be obvious what's running. And I support customers who have virtualized environments where I'm basically using virtual machines, and for a lot of these customers, I'll ask them to spin up a machine for me just to do testing, or I need a machine just for a couple of weeks to do a migration or something like that. And I'll go back in a year or two later, and that virtual machine is still running. It's still there. No one's touched it. I've had customers that didn't even know they had virtual machines running that I had access to. Um, I would notify them and say, hey, this machine is still running on, I still have access to this VM that we asked for a year ago, and we haven't used it in a year, and it's news to them. This is the first I'm hearing about it. Well, that's a major concern for IT security, because now we have infrastructure that's running that isn't even needed, so we're needlessly expanding the surface area of attack. So that's another form of sprawl that we have to worry about that virtualization makes possible. So some of the cloud risks, the management plane breaches, which I talked about what the management plane is. So if somebody breaches the management plane, that's really not a whole lot different from breaking into your data center. So that's certainly a major concern. Resource exhaustion, which is things like denial of service attacks and traffic analysis. So this is anything that where somebody is attacking your infrastructure and causing your resources to get overwhelmed, which is the classical example of a denial of service attack. That certainly becomes a bigger concern in the cloud because, again, we don't have physical access to that equipment, and if your cloud service provider is not able to handle that, then obviously you have a major problem. Isolation control feature, we're sharing all this space in the cloud with other people. It could be isolation of storage, isolation of databases, isolation of virtual machines themselves. If there's a failure of that isolation, then we have a data breach, and it's certainly something to be aware of and something that we have to understand how that works. Insecure, incomplete data deletion. Again, we have very little control of deletion in the cloud. Just because we told the cloud service provider to do a deletion doesn't necessarily mean that it happened. But going back to the server sprawl example, with server sprawl, where we don't know that VMs are running, or we forget that they're running, or there's just, it's so easy to spin up a machine that we just spin them up whenever we need them and leave them laying around. Same thing can happen with our storage, where, we're not concerned anymore. I've talked about this before, that with a lot of these cloud storage platforms, they charge you more to read your data back than they do to store it. And usually, they don't really want you to delete that data. So they make it easy for you to kind of store and forget. So, you might be storing data that you don't need, or have data that you don't need, that in your own physical infrastructure, you would have long since deleted it. But because it's in the cloud and it's not costing you anything to leave it there, you just leave it there. But again, that having that data available and leaving that data in place is needlessly expanding the surface area for attack. So it's certainly something to think about. And we have control conflict. Well, let's talk about some of the legal risks as well. There's data protection and jurisdictional risks, again, with the cloud, because of the, as far as the geography of where your data is being stored, crossing state lines and things like that. So lots of jurisdictional problems in even, different countries and so forth. And then you have the problem with law enforcement. I don't want to say law enforcement's a problem, but the problem with law enforcement in the cloud is that if a crime is committed using infrastructure in the cloud, you may get caught up in an investigation like that. And also you have no control if somebody wants to seize equipment in the cloud service provider. You don't have control of that or you don't even necessarily know that happened. Or the cloud service provider can turn over your data to law enforcement without even telling you, without you even knowing about it. Not because they wanted to, but in some cases because they were told to do that. They could have gotten a national security letter telling them they had to turn over data that belongs to your company or your organization. You're not even aware of that. That certainly could be a concern, something to be aware of. And then, of course, licensing. And you may have seen this, with Microsoft Azure, that when you build a virtual machine, you can tell Microsoft, I already have a license, and then you get a nice big discount on your virtual machine that you're running month to month, which is great, but they sure make it easy to abuse that licensing. I mean, you can spin up a machine and say you have a license, but run it without one for a while. Geez, if you get audited, what would happen, right? And there's certainly stories. You can go out and look on the internet and look up stories about organizations that got audited, because of the agreements that we have with these big companies. They got audited for their utilization of licensing and found to be in violation of their licensing, and had to pay millions of dollars in licensing fees, or else they would get sued by the company. And that can make or break an organization. I think there was one story I read a couple months ago about a community college out in Nevada, I think it was, that was close to bankruptcy, and somebody tipped off an auditor that they were using licenses they weren't entitled to with Microsoft, and they came in and did an audit, and they had to pay something like $22 million, and they had to cut back on classes, fire a whole bunch of staff, and practically sunk the school. So that's a risk, right? That's a risk that could put us out of business. So we have to be aware of it and how we mitigate that risk and make sure that we're in compliance with things like licensing. So some of the attack vectors for the cloud, new technology has given us some additional attack vectors, like the guest breakout problem I talked about, compromising identity so that people can use your management plane without having proper authorization to do so. API compromise. So I talked about how all this stuff can be controlled through APIs. Storage can be done through APIs. Databases can be accessed through APIs. The management plane with APIs. And anytime you have an API, you have the possibility of some application vulnerability that from those APIs, where you could use buffer overflow attacks or cross-site scripting, and all kinds of things you can use to try to that attackers can use to get access to those things. And again, a lot of those techniques are pretty well understood, and they're accessible from the web. So, from the internet, you can be anywhere and launch these attacks. You don't necessarily have to be inside the network. So it certainly makes it a lot easier for folks to try these attacks. And then attacks against the infrastructure itself, and attacks against the cloud carrier, which is the network infrastructure. So in other words, we can't use the cloud if we can't get to the cloud. If we don't have access to the cloud, and there could be attacks against the cloud carrier to impact the largest number of customers. If you wanted to impact the most companies as possible in a single attack, if you attack the cloud carrier and impact the ability for people to use something like Amazon's cloud service, I should say, or Google's cloud service, you can impact a tremendous number of companies because of all the the sheer volume of people that are using those cloud service providers. So it's certainly and why are we concerned about that, even if we're not the cloud service provider? Because we could be one of those companies caught up in that, or one of the organizations caught up in an attack like that. And it's important to understand that something like that can happen, and make sure we have some plan of how to handle something like that. And to that end, we're also going to talk in the next section, I'm going to talk about security controls.